Well, welcome everybody. It's good to be with you today. We're focusing on multi-site and what it takes to be successful. And we're going to be looking at some trends that we're seeing as we work with churches across the country. Looking at these 5 key questions today, questions around leadership development. How can we prepare our leadership to be prepared to launch new campuses? We'll be looking at the structure that we need to use as we move forward with multi-site. Also be looking at the critical role of campus pastors. The fourth topic, we'll be looking at strategy, multi-site strategy, and then the 5th question will be around the size of the church. What size is appropriate before churches begin to move forward with a multi-site strategy? But before we dive into the conversation today, I want to introduce you to some of the folks that are going to be joining us. The Unstuck group. We began to look at just all of the years of experience in multi-site, and believe it or not, over 40 years of experience working in multi-site churches through the years. And several of the people will be joining us today. Let me first introduce you to Paul Alexander. Paul is the executive pastor of Sun Valley Community Church out in the Phoenix area. Paul, say hello to the crew here.
Hey, Tony. Really glad to be with you guys today. Thanks for having me.
And I believe we have Amy Anderson. Amy recently was the executive director of weekend services at Eaglebrook Church up in the Minneapolis area. Amy, are you with us? She may not be joined just yet. Also, Ryan Steigel. Ryan was most recently the director of campus expansion at New Point Community Church in Ohio. Ryan, say hello to the crowd here.
Great to be here. Thanks, Tony.
And last but not least, the ever popular Warren Bird. Warren is the director of research for the Leadership Network, and I just refer to him as the U.S. church geek, because he knows more about stats around churches in America, including on this topic of multi-site, than any other person I know. So Warren, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you. And Tony, I know a lot because I hang around with people like you.
Well, very good. Hey, I just wanted to let you know as well, though we'll be having a conversation here throughout the hour that we'll be together today. We'll also be taking live chat questions. And with us in the chat room today is David D'Angelo. David is the Central Director of Family Ministries at Northway Church. Most recently, also the Executive Director of Development at New Point Community Church. Northway is located in the Pittsburgh area. I think David's actually a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. As a Cleveland Browns fan, I will not hold that against him, though. So that's the group that's going to be joining you for the conversation today. And we'd love for you to participate also online. It's hashtag multi-site unstuck if you'd like to share your thoughts or questions on Twitter or on Facebook. So we're going to just dive into the first topic. And this has to do with leadership development and how looking at how we can prepare that leadership bench for new campuses. As I've worked with churches across the country who are engaging in multi-site, typically it's not a lack of financial resources to move into multi-site. It's not a lack of locations that they could be going to. The big challenge that churches face when they're looking at launching new campuses is a lack of leadership. And so with that, Paul, I want to turn to you first with this question. Why is leadership development so important for a church going multi-site?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I think one of the primary reasons leadership development is so important in multi-site is because culture is replicated through people, not through policies, not through procedures, not through ministry programs, but through people. And multi-site is not a ministry program. It's something different. When you're multi-siting, you're replicating your culture and your DNA. And one of the big questions you need to ask yourself on the front end is, do we have a DNA or do we have a culture that's really worth replicating? And do we have people that embody that can go from here to there to help make that happen in that new location? And so, yeah, I think the first place most people want to start with the multi-site conversation is kind of the how-to nuts and bolts science side of it, and we'll get to that in the conversation. But I think the best place to start is with the who, because you get the right people in the place, and the right people are always going to come up with great solutions to new obstacles.
And by the way, Paul's speaking from experience. Tell us, Paul, how many locations for Sun Valley in Phoenix?
Yeah, Sun Valley has 4 campuses right now. We're actually in the process right now of opening the 5th one. So yeah, it's a fun season.
Yes, it is. All right, Warren, what are some of the ways you're seeing churches practically develop new leaders?
Well, many ways, the simplest of which is just the apprentice model, 2 Timothy 2:2, train others who train others who train others who train others. There are actually 4 generations or 5, depending on how you argue that verse, in churches like Community Christian in Naperville. The Fergusons, who've written books like Exponential, have really caught on, not add but multiply, and everything you do, always have somebody tagging along. A practical expression of that is the idea of internships and residencies. We recently did a survey where we asked large churches, do you have an internship or residency program? And to our surprise, 74% said yes. So we dug deeper. We did a research report. It's a free download if you go to leadnet.org/intern. The gist of it is not that people are getting cheap labor, but more that people, their first motive is, I want to develop others for kingdom workers. Yes, we get to cherry pick a few of the best, and that is indeed where a lot of your future staff will come from. But hey, we want to put workers in the harvest who are trained, who have healthy marriages, healthy experiences in ministry. And that's a major pipeline that we're just now discovering more about.
Well, another area too that I think we need to pay attention to in churches is just that opportunity to raise up volunteer leaders. And there's no better place to start in the areas of small group leadership and ministry team leadership, and then using that not only to gain just the characteristics and competencies that are required for leading teams, but then also hopefully creating a relationship between those volunteer leaders and ultimately the staff leaders and the pastors then that are leading the church, and developing almost a pathway for what leadership would look like. In fact, I think we even have a diagram to show what we're talking about here, because this model of a leadership pathway really it comes to us from Exodus 18, where Jethro comes to Moses and basically is encouraging Moses and challenging Moses. You're going to wear yourself out if you continue to lead like you are. And this is where Jethro gives Moses that encouragement to identify other leaders, leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. And you can see from this diagram, let me just walk you through this real quick. And we can see these opportunities in our ministries. Leaders of tens, those would be leaders of small groups or small teams. The great thing with these leaders is they're leading by example. They're modeling for others. This is how we do things around here. And so by able to provide that model, it's encouraging people to take their next steps. Now, the challenge is if that's all you do in your leadership, you're going to become the lid to the growth of your team and the growth of your ministry, because you're going to be doing everything. And that's why some leaders then take this next step to become leaders of 50s, where they're moving to a place where they're leading other people. And here is when we learn how to delegate tasks and responsibilities. And we can picture this in several ministry areas of the church, whether it's children's ministry or student ministry or guest services, all those types of frontline ministries where folks that become leaders of 50s are learning how to pass on tasks to other people on their team, so they're not doing it all themselves. Then leaders, though, have to go into a different place, because if you know anything about delegation, you know this to be the case. When you delegate a task, you have to assign the task, you have to coach the person on how to get it done, you have to follow up with them to make sure the task was completed. If there's a decision to be made along the way, they're coming back to you to get that decision made. And when the task is completed, they're going to come to you to get another task assigned. And so what we have to encourage leaders to do is to move to this next level, leader of hundreds, where they begin to lead other leaders. And this is where real empowerment begins to take place, where there's this opportunity to give real responsibilities over significant ministries in the church, and then allow those leaders to pour into the folks that are going to be on the front lines, engaging in relationships and doing ministry across the life of the church. And then we get to this next level of leadership, the leader of thousands, where someone learns how to lead through the vision. And this is the person that's really the catalyst for a campus, a church, a large ministry. These are the folks that are really helping to shape where the church goes in the future. And so you're seeing this path of leadership development that has to happen. And the churches that are really learning how to multiply across many campuses are recognizing we just can't assume that leaders are going to come to us and be capable of leading a new campus launch or a new ministry launch. We actually have to have an intentional strategy to help people take these steps to move from leaders of tens to 50s to hundreds to thousands. Paul, as you're launching campuses and looking at leadership development, what's one of the key barriers that you find that your church is having to address?
Yeah, I'll just put it really simply. The biggest issue of obstacles for us accomplishing the vision that we believe Jesus has given us is leaders and money. And I think if you talk to most pastors out there who are forward thinking and are chasing a really big vision that Jesus has given them, those are going to be the two big obstacles that they face: money and leaders. And you're talking about leadership. That's a big deal. And because again, culture is replicated through people, and it's really hard to hire someone in from the outside and immediately put them in a high level of leadership, because they may make decisions that aren't necessarily through the filter of your culture, and it could accidentally lead you in a tangent.
Very good. And it does look like we have Amy Anderson with us. Amy, welcome.
Thank you.
It's always good when the technology works, isn't it?
Yeah, I made fun of you not being a Mac user just a few too many times.
Well, it's good to have you with us again. Amy was most recently with Eaglebrook Church in the Minneapolis area and Eaglebrook. Amy, how long has Eaglebrook been engaged in Multisite?
We launched our first Multisite in 2006. So it feels like 50 years, but it's been about 10.
And how many locations now?
We have 6 locations across the Twin Cities.
Yeah, and Eaglebrook is reaching well over 20,000 people in those locations too. So it's been a remarkable story. And I want to shift to the second question. It's regarding structure and how we can help more people engage in ministry in more places. And so with that, Amy, the question for you is this: what does the ideal structure look like for a multi-site church?
Sure. Well, of course, that depends on your size a little bit and where you're at in the multi-site journey. I think a lot of churches, when you first start out and you have 2 or 3 sites, the natural way to lead is sort of through your current leaders. And so you'll have, I hate to use the term main campus, but you have your original campus where a lot of your leaders are in kids ministries and student ministries. And as you launch, those leaders tend to take the next leaders under their wings and set the tone for the vision for the ministry, and if I can use the word brand. But over time, when you get to like that 3rd or 4th location, it starts to shift. And if I can say, you enter the matrix, and it begins a new way of leading where you've got these central leaders solely focused on how are we going to operate the ministry. And your leadership team, your top leadership team, really becomes your central leadership. And through those folks, you start to replicate specialists at every location who take their cues from those leaders. So on the slide here, you can kind of see you've got campus pastors over each location. And by the way, about that 3rd campus launch, you start to even put a campus pastor at the original site, which feels a little strange, I think, for churches at the beginning, because you've got your main communicator typically at that location. But you've got a campus pastor who will lead staff, and then you've got central experts who are going to be giving vision to what those programs should look like. And I will say, this is where tensions really start to come out in a multi-site environment, because you start to wrestle with the fact that you've got 2 bosses now. So do I listen to my campus pastor who I report to, or do I listen to the central leader? And so things like how you make decisions and how and who gets to make what calls starts to come into play as well.
Very good. And having worked with a lot of churches that have gone from 2 to 3 to 4 or 5 campuses along the way, that tension that she speaks of between, now is it the campus pastor's call, or is there somebody in the central leadership team that makes the call? Who does that? And so, Warren, with that, let's talk about the campus pastor and how that person fits into this matrix structure. How do you see that playing out in different churches, and in those cases where that tension exists, how do decisions get made?
Amy did a great job of describing it, and her visual with the straight lines and solid lines and the dotted lines looks so nice and clean on paper. Yes, you're all laughing because especially after you get to the third or more site, then it gets a lot more complicated. And then you start kicking in a central services function, which, by the way, we did a survey of multi-site churches, got 500 or so to reply, leadnet.org, and then once you get to the homepage, search in the search bar, just put the word scorecard, and you get this big report with all these visuals and everything. And one of the things we learned is we asked, when did you start going to central services? That's one office that focuses on HR and counting the offerings and the branding and the communications and stuff like that. And I thought they'd say between 3 and 4, maybe even 5 campuses. And actually, it was as they shifted from the second to the third campus that they ramped on the central service support. But back to your question, Tony, of how does this play out? The key make or break, as I see it, is the senior pastor has to retain a personal loyalty relationship with the campus pastors. Example, I spent a day week before last with Andy Stanley and his senior staff, North Point, third largest church in America. And it was his senior staff, plus he also invited his campus pastors, just so that there is a face time with Andy. And that is so important. I've talked with Bill Hybels. When I say, how often do you meet with your campus pastors? He says, weekly. And I work hard to make that a priority. Now, it doesn't always happen weekly for most cases, but it's the relational component underneath, the loyalty to the vision, the alignment of spirits, if you will, that makes the dotted line, solid line dynamic work or not work.
Well, if Warren is the Yoda of church research, Ryan, what does that make you?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
Ryan is our Director of Strategic Resources at the Unstuck group, and with that title, he gets to help us shape the research we're doing through our team. Right. And with that, Ryan, I'd like you to help to dig into the numbers that we're seeing too as well when it comes to multi-site churches and those that are actually using this matrix structure that we're talking about.
Absolutely, Tony. And later this week, we're actually releasing a research white paper on how multi-site teams are working together across multiple locations. And one of the things that we saw in that study is that this matrix structure really is becoming less of an option and much more of a best practice, like Warren said. And so we saw 63% of multi-site churches of varying sizes utilizing this matrix structure. Now that increases with size, right? So the smallest churches, about 17% of them are utilizing this matrix structure. They just haven't built the staff yet and gotten to a place where they can establish that central services team. But by the time you hit 3,000 people and you've got kind of this mega church multi-site focus going on, 73% of churches are utilizing that matrix structure. And again, it's just becoming this best practice now that we're seeing more and more churches utilize.
Yeah. And I mean, think about it this way. I have 2 kids that work for the great company, Chick-fil-A. My son actually is a shift supervisor for some Saturday shifts at his store. And if there's a decision to be made at that store on his shift, they go to him for that decision. They're not calling to some central office to get a decision made. Now, the central office still does shape what's on the menu, what's our quality of service, how do we treat our customers, how do we communicate and market, but it's at the store level that the day-to-day decisions are being made to move forward. And that's similar to this matrix structure that we're seeing in churches as well.
Absolutely.
Let's shift topics, and we're going to move on then and look at more specifically the role of campus pastors and what we should be looking for when we select a campus pastor. And Warren, I want to turn to you again. what are some of those absolute musts that campus pastors must be doing to be effective? What do we need to be looking for?
Let me start with what they aren't, and they aren't an MC.
Okay.
They aren't a pure announcer. They're someone who knows in a team-playing way how to cast vision, how to take those whatever few moments they have on the platform to really personalize in some way that people identify with them as the leader, the pastor of that campus. They're the ones that wake up in the morning praying and focused on that campus, saying, Lord, how are we going to develop leaders here? How are we going to solve this discipleship issue here? They truly have the pastoral heart, but they don't have the need to communicate that pastoral heart by being the preacher. Now, some campus pastors do teach at different levels, but primarily being a campus pastor is being part of something bigger and being able to always tie in what we're doing here, how it relates to the bigger entity of this one church in 2 or more locations that we're part of. We did another research thing on campus pastors, and you can go leadnet.org, and in the search box, just type in the word campus pastors. And we had Jim Tomberlin and several others kind of list, okay, for all your work with campus pastors, what do you see as the core qualities? And I've named some of those, and you can have more of them in that list.
Very good. Paul, again, experience with 4 campuses and another one along the way. We won't make you rank your current campus pastors, but I'm assuming with that experience, you've identified some effective traits that you're looking for with the pastors you put into that position. So give us some sense of what you look for when you're trying to identify a person who's going to be effective in that role.
Sure thing, Tony. I think Warren hit it really well. He mentioned teaching, and I think that a lot of the way a church answers this question depends on your model. So you may or may not be looking for a communicator based on your teaching model at your church. If you're not looking for a teaching guy, what you're probably looking for is what I would call as a relational manager, someone who can run the play or run the store. They have the ability to shepherd the congregation there locally. They have the ability to lead through staff and manage the team. They have the ability to align to the vision of the church that already exists. They don't have to come up with that. And this is where a lot of tension comes into play is, who's making decisions, but whose vision is it? And a lot of guys that I've seen, campus pastors, who probably shouldn't sit in that seat, they have their own dreams, their own visions, their own ideas about this church they have in their heart they want to build and create. And it may or may not be the church they're serving at. And when you're a campus pastor, you're replicating culture, you're replicating systems and processes. You're not necessarily building your own from scratch. That's why I say it's run the play or run the store instead of come up with your own store. Does that make sense?
Sure does. I want to come back to you in a second, Paul, with a follow-up question. But Warren, Paul mentioned this distinction between churches that have live teachers at their campuses and those that are using video for delivery of the message. And I think your last research confirmed it's still about a 50-50 split. Is that correct?
Well, the first time we studied several hundred churches, we found it was roughly a third, and a third. A third do almost exclusively video teaching, a third do almost exclusively in person, and a third do a mix of the two, which, Tony, ends up with your 50-50. In our more recent study, the one you get to leadnet.org and then type in the word scorecard on the search bar, we found 2 interesting things. That the tilt was shifting more towards in-person teaching, just slightly, except in bigger churches. Starting at about 4 or more campuses, video becomes more and more dominant. And frankly, in recent years, the working out of video technology is so much smoother. Not only is the public more comfortable with it because we have it everywhere, but frankly, in most churches that use any kind of image magnification, beyond the about the 7th row, people are looking up at the screen, not at you. You're trying to get eye contact, and they're looking up there anyway, because you're much more magnified and easier to see.
Very good. All right. So Paul, I mentioned I want to come back to you because actually I think I agree with you on this, but you've actually said it out loud, that student pastors make terrible campus pastors. Why is that?
So you're outing me in front of everybody right now. Okay. So everybody who's a student pastor who's watching this, I'm sorry, kind of. You know what? I think, let me put it this way. Every job has a natural personality that trends towards that job. There's a reason why young men or young women go to school to be engineers, because they're naturally wired to be engineers. That's who Jesus has made them to be. There's a reason why plumbers have certain personalities, because Jesus has made them to be a great plumber. Student ministry guys, generally speaking, this isn't an always statement, it's a most of the time statement. Generally speaking, they want to build something, they want to create something, they want to speak, they want to build a culture. And I think Multisite got it wrong early on in the Multisite movement, is we naturally went towards student ministry guys first because we recognized the leadership gift that they had. And we asked them to join this thing called Multisite as campus pastors. And we realized quickly in the Multisite movement that probably wasn't the best decision, because all these guys, now they had more authority, more influence. They wanted to build their thing instead of replicate something that was given to them. What I've discovered is student ministry guys make much better church planters than they do campus pastors. And the better guys on your staff to be looking for campus pastors are they're probably an associate pastor. They are an executive pastor who have a high relational EQ. They're maybe a groups pastor who understands groups and systems and people. So I would shift more towards those kind of roles in a student. So all you student ministry guys, gals, sorry, that's not a ding on you. Be exactly who Jesus made you to be.
Yeah, that's right. And that's not necessarily the case for every youth pastor out there, but generally that is a trend that we see. All right, Amy, I want to turn, Warren, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just, I affirm what you're saying, but know that there's a whole latitude in that, Andy Stanley and Craig Rochelle do these one-day catalysts, and in certain ways, they are as opposite as can be in that Life Church is like, hey, you put the napkins the way we do it. I mean, they're very, this is how we do it. You follow this model. And that works wonderfully for them. Andy is really, let's push the autonomy as far as we can. So the student ministry type person who enjoys, making it up continually would do much better in a multi-site environment. Those that allow a great autonomy and expect a great autonomy, that's a good niche for them.
Absolutely. I agree with you, Warren.
Gosh, I was hoping we were going to have a battle there for a minute. Anyways, Amy, let's talk about the folks in the central leadership roles, which is a position you held for many years at Eagle Brook. How as a central leader, trying to influence what's happening across all the campuses, how do you interact effectively with that campus pastor?
Boy, if there are two main ingredients, I think, for central leaders to be effective, and I learned this the hard way sometimes, first you have to communicate really well. And what I mean by that is the worst thing a central leader can do is surprise a campus pastor with a decision, with a direction. And sometimes what we do as central leaders is we actually jump over the campus pastor and go right to their staff and start creating things, and the campus pastor is left out of the loop. So again, that's the messiness of the matrix, that you have to learn right away that the campus pastor is the point person, and you need to bring their voice in early. They need to be informed, they need to be influential in it, and they need buy-in before you start rolling it out further. And the second thing in that, I guess, is what I said earlier, is just, that whole dotted line, hard line, how you make decisions, having crystal clear clarity as soon as possible about who makes what decisions, so that no one's stepping on one another's toes and making the wrong call here and there, or inadvertently messing things up in the matrix. So I know once our campus pastors knew, well, here's the decisions in the realm that I get to lead in and serve in and make decisions on, everything flowed so much more smoothly than when we kind of didn't know and we're living in the gray.
All this conversation about the matrix is making me feel like I need to choose between the red pill and the blue pill. And I can't remember which one I'm supposed to choose. So let's move on. The fourth question we wanted to look at is the strategy question, and trying to discern what are the fastest growing multi-site churches doing differently? And before I bring Ryan into this part of the conversation, let me just say this. What I've learned as I've worked in consultations and coaching with churches across the country who are stepping into multi-site, that whoever your church is before you start launching campuses just gets magnified after you go into multi-site. And so if your church is healthy and growing before you start adding new locations, that's going to be replicated, and then it's going to be multiplied. The impact is going to come faster when you start launching campuses. But the other side is true too. If your church is unhealthy, if it's not growing, you start launching campuses, the unhealth that you have as a church will get magnified and multiplied to multiple locations as well. Which brings us then, Ryan, I want to pull you in on this. As you've been researching these churches, what impact does having a strategy have for multi-site churches?
Right. Well, this is one that our team especially gets excited about, because anytime you say the word strategy, I think this group just kind of perks their ears up, you know.
We geek out a little bit.
We do a little bit. We, polish our pocket protectors and maybe that's just me. Maybe that's just me. No, but this was really interesting for us particularly. I got Paul there. This is really interesting for us though, because we were doing this research. We started looking at what is causing multi-site churches to grow and what is causing some churches to grow faster than other churches. So here's an encouraging thing. On average, multi-site churches are growing. So that right there is some encouragement. But what we saw is that churches that have a strategy integrated throughout the entire organization from top to bottom, from ministry to ministry, are growing at a rate 44% faster than those multi-site churches that do not have that strategy integrated throughout the entire organization. And that to us was just phenomenal, mind-blowing, and made us even more passionate about what we get to do as a group.
So I think what that speaks to is it's the strategy first. Well, vision, then strategy to see that vision get accomplished, and then multi-site complements that.
Absolutely.
But multi-site in and of itself is not the strategy for growth.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I just want to make sure. Sometimes I'm not smart enough to keep up, so I just wanted to make sure. But also, just looking, Paul, at how that strategy needs to flow through the entire organization. Again, put this into practical terms. How do you do this in Sun Valley now when you're in 4 going on 5 locations? How do you keep that strategy uniform throughout?
Yeah, so we alluded to this at the very top of the conversation. Strategy really answers the question, how? What are the nuts and bolts? How are we going to bridge the gap between reality and vision? And the churches that have a strategic plan that's forced all the way through the entire organization or integrated through the entire organization, simple things like they all have the same vision. Children's ministry doesn't have a different vision statement than the overall church. They all have the same core values. They all have the same culture. A term, campus constants, is going to be a term we're going to dig into a little bit in this conversation. In other words, they all have the same ministry playbook. One of the things we do, you asked real tangibly here at Sun Valley, how do we keep this consistent? Our central service team, we call it a development team. It's a little less corporate feeling. So our ministry development team, they're tasked with a couple of things. They're tasked with making sure that content is the same on every campus. So our children's ministry staff at our 5th campus don't have to worry about, well, what are we going to do for early childhood this weekend? That decision's already been made. Our content's the same. They're also tasked with making sure that our ministry practices are consistent. When that 5th campus rolls out, they're not asking, well, how do we do check-in for children's ministry? Or are all of our student ministries all going to go to the same camps or not? They're making sure ministry practice is consistent. They're making sure communication happens. Communication is a two-way street, but someone has to initiate it. And so we land on our ministry development team to initiate communication between campuses. And then finally, we ask them to take on the posture of a consultant. In other words, they're there to help coach and consult the staff on those campuses, but the staff on the campuses are executing the ministry. And so, a strategic, Ryan talked about churches that have a strategy integrated throughout the entire organization. It's important because last part of this, a transition we made. I'm going to roll back here for a second, Tony. Transition we had to deal with early on, and Warren, you'll probably see this bear out in research. I'll talk about it anecdotally. We had to move from an oral culture to a written culture as we went multi-site, and we had to move away from oral tradition and just realize that if it's not written down, it just doesn't exist. Because as we were broadening our team and more people were leading, if they didn't have the oral tradition and the story, they could lead in a tangent. And so writing all of this down, how do we do check-in? It sounds like a lot of detail, but you'll be happy that you did it.
Well, it is a lot of detail, and frankly, that could get at one of the key things that a pastor, a church need to consider is, are they willing to try to develop strategy and system to support going multi-site, or do they want to lead the way they have through one voice and one team and one location? And there's still many, many healthy, growing churches that are doing ministry through one location. And so this could really speak to one of those key decisions churches have to make if they're willing to take that next step. Paul, you referenced the campus constants. Can you share a little bit more of what that looks like?
Yeah, sure thing. For example, at Sun Valley, we've developed it's a written document, and it's a living document. So in other words, it's probably not once and for all. This isn't the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. This is our campus constants. They act as guardrails for our culture and our practices in all of our campuses. It helps our staff understand who makes what decisions, and going back to, is it campus staff or central service staff, and it helps them understand our culture. Our financial model is even written into our campus constants. The first year a campus exists, we do not expect that campus to contribute to the overall ministry of Sun Valley. They're not giving towards missions, for example. They are a mission that first year. And so there's a strategy to move towards financial viability that's written down in that campus constants. Culture, values, leadership distinctives. Yeah. Is that helpful?
That is very good. All right, well, let's continue this. The last key question we want to focus on is related to size. And the question here is, how big is big enough for a church to go multi-site? And so, Ryan, let's first dig into our numbers. We can ask Warren chime in a little bit on this too, but as you look at the data that we've collected, how likely are churches of different sizes to be multi-site?
Right. Well, it was really surprising when we looked at the data, just the range of multi-site churches that we saw. I mean, we saw churches coming in through this survey. Again, we'll release that white paper later this week. We saw churches coming in with just a few hundred in attendance that were multi-site, and churches of up to 24,000 in attendance that were multi-site. But what we did see is that the larger a church is, the more likely they are to be or become multi-site. So churches under 500, just 4% of churches were multi-site. When a church hits 500 to 999, you've got about 15% that are multi-site. But then once you break 1,000, almost half, 45% of churches between 1,000 and 2,099 in attendance have now gone multi-site. And then once you hit that 3,000 plus number, start hitting that mega church range, multi-site again just kind of becomes this best practice now, where 70% of churches of that size are showing up now as a multi-site church. So you really start to see, as a church gets larger, the likelihood of them becoming multi-site becomes more and more. And it really is starting to take kind of that best practice spot in church culture and church strategy.
Warren, I'm assuming your data would confirm that too, that once it's the larger churches are more likely to be engaging in a multi-site strategy?
Yes, and one other thing, every time we've done one of those snapshots like what Ryan did, totally agree with what you found, Ryan, we found that the median start point for multi-site gets a little smaller. In other words, way back when, it was only the mega churches that tried it. And then you had churches in the 1,000 range doing it. And now you regularly see church in the multiple hundreds starting multi-site. Now, are they doing it on different scales? Yes. But it's demonstrating that multi-site can be viable much smaller, from a smaller launch point, than most people had previously thought.
Well, you
right
mentioned
now, I'd say the sweet spot is 700-800, because you've got at least at that point enough momentum, enough energy, enough capacity to be able to send 100 people out or so and not be seriously crippled from the sending church.
All right, so you're getting into the numbers thing. Amy, do you like talking numbers?
Not as much as Ryan, but dabble.
Warren mentioned that 800 to 1,000, and we've talked internally at the Unstuck group about 1,000 really being kind of the number to be shooting for before you actually do a launch. And do you want to explain why we've kind of set that as that minimum target before you start moving into multiple locations?
Yeah, I think Warren started to put his toe in this water, which is momentum is a key ingredient for launching multi-site. Multi-site's really hard. I mean, it's exciting, but there's a lot of work that needs to go into it. And as you think about launching a multi-site, you still have your current site. And so you need a good leadership bench to lead that existing original campus. And then you need a phenomenal leadership bench to go launch that new one. And you need leaders and you need people who will serve, and you need to recreate an environment. Your church is attractive and growing probably because of the momentum. There's probably a noticeable crowd. There's probably noticeable crowding. There's some energy. And to replicate who you are, you want to send a crowd to launch a crowd and a new growing one. And so that's a big part of it. I also think psychologically, once your church starts to feel that crowding and you breach the 80%, full mark, you also get buy-in, I believe, from your church attenders who are going to start to give sacrificially, financially, and with their time to go, yeah, we need to open up some seats at optimal times, and this is a good strategy, and I'm going to give towards this, and I see the need.
All right, so Paul, I stole a little bit of your thunder earlier talking about the need to be healthy before going to multi-site, but can you maybe expound on that a little bit and see where that's helped Sun Valley move forward and where maybe you've had to overcome some challenges to shore some things up before you move forward?
Yeah, I think, leadership in one sense is the artistic side of it is managing the emotion of the room, which is essentially momentum. And so multi-site is a delivery tool for momentum that you already had. Multi-site's not going to give you momentum. You don't have it already. What it's going to do is, you mentioned it earlier, if you don't have it already, and you're stuck already, you multi-site, now you're going to have two campuses that aren't just stuck, but they're actually declining.
You're going to, I got it. You're going to be multi-stuck.
That's something like that. What's interesting though, Tony, Warren, some research that I saw come out of Leadership Network some time ago was that it's not just that moment of going from one campus to two, but the majority of multi-site churches are stuck as well. In fact, 85% of multi-site churches never get past that third campus entirely. And so there's a reason for that. Coming back to something you talked about with growth, if you're not already a growing church, and if you already aren't willing to face down big decisions that come with growth, like restructuring, doing things differently than you've done them before. And if you're a growing church, you've had to change along the way. Multi-site isn't like you multi-site, now you don't have to change anymore. You still have to continue to change, or you're going to get stuck at 3 campuses.
Very good. All right. Well, Ryan, Warren, Paul, Amy, I want you to stick around, okay, because we're gonna have some questions for you in a moment. But for everybody else, particularly my friends at Grace Church in Southern Pines, North Carolina, who I was with yesterday, I know they're watching today because they're already multi-site but getting ready to launch another campus. We just want to tell you that at the Unstuck group, we're here to serve you. So if you're that church you're bumping up 100,000, you have a healthy strategy for growth and you want to multiply that, we'd love to help you take your next steps. If you're a church that has already opened up some campuses but are wanting to expand further to more locations, we'd love to help you take those next steps as well. Basically, the Unstuck group has a 3-step process for multi-site churches or those getting ready to go multi-site. The first is a readiness assessment to help you look at, do you have the foundation in place? Is there health in place for the church to replicate in multiple locations? Secondly, then we'll help you put together a strategic plan to actually launch those campuses to multiply what's happening through multi-site. And then a third step is looking at your staffing and structure. And this is where we'll begin to give you some coaching, not only about what does the staff need to look like at the campus that we're launching, but this is where we'll also begin to look at those central services, or Paul's team, he called that ministry development team, where you begin to build that matrix organization. And then lastly, we don't want to just give you the assessment, help you with the plan, help you with the structure, and then wash our hands. We want to walk with you through the implementation, and hopefully praying for your success in this. We want you to win. And so we'll also engage you in our activate and renew process so that we can be with you as you're implementing and working through the change that comes through Multisite. And with that, I do want to offer the opportunity to respond to some questions. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Feel free to submit your questions there. And I know Dave is trying to help us screen and responding to some of these questions as we go. First question, I think, Amy, this one really, you might be a better fit. Well, let me ask you this, Amy, when at Eaglebrook, now at 6 locations, in addition to an executive pastor type role, do you also have somebody on the staff that is just responsible for Multisite for all the campus ministries?
Yeah, that was a position that was added probably about 4 years ago, so somewhere around the 4th or 5th campus, and it was definitely a needed role. In the interim, our executive pastor had kind of had a straight line reporting relationship with our campus pastors, giving them direction, and I, from a weekend perspective, obviously spent a lot of time with them. And so it got to the point where they needed to have a leader to kind of aggregate their thoughts and to represent them around the senior leadership table. It was an interesting transition for us, just because, again, it's a new piece of the matrix, and now who makes what decisions and how does it shift? But it was definitely a necessary role that propelled us, to be able to move forward.
So the key question that was submitted then is the distinction between the executive pastor's responsibility and then this pastor over the campuses or the multi-site strategy. What would the distinction be between those two roles?
Yeah, I think it's, the executive pastor, as your church grows and your staff grows, I see the executive pastor as the great integrator of how the whole ministry works together. So they aren't focused on a campus or the weekend services or operations or those various areas. They are leading the leaders of the church. And so that campus pastor leader, they often called it like a central director, their main role is more so taking the things that has been centrally developed, as Paul said, and really goes, how is that working through our campuses? Because campus pastors are giving feedback, and so are their staff, on how these various strategies are working. And so that person tends to be the conduit between central ministry development and execution at the campuses. The executive pastor is a level up, not only taking in central ministry and central campuses, but also operations and all the other things that make Multisite run.
Amy, I think this one will fit you as well. Greg asks, when do we need to move all of our creative, graphics, video, and so on to central services?
Oh, that's such a painful question. Those changes are some of the hardest. I have war wounds on, some self-inflicted. There's something so beautiful about having all of those artists together in the way that they can work. I would have guessed your question maybe would have flipped. When do we have to take them out of central and throw them into campus?
Oh, interesting.
A lot of this, if I just separate out for a minute the worship pastors, the worship pastors, I think they need to go to their campus, honestly, as soon as they can. That's the campus pastor who they report to are the ones who get to see them, wrong word, but perform or, do what they're supposed to do. They see them live. They own that campus with the campus pastor and the rest of the staff. And so creating that community, I always loved that we had to office together for our first 4 locations. And so we kind of had the best of both worlds. They all lived together and shared ideas and created, but it's a good space for them to be with their campus. When it comes to the artists of like print, web, and media, I recommend keeping that team centralized as much as possible and keep them on the top creative priorities of the church versus dividing that out and throwing them into campuses.
All right, Paul, this one might be for you. William asks, what strategies should we exhaust first prior to launching our first campus?
That's a great question. I'm glad they asked it. You know, before you go multi-site, I'd encourage you to go multi-service and multi-venue. So multi-service, if you can't do it multiple times in a single location, you're probably not going to do it multiple times in multiple locations. So go multi-service first, add new services. By the way, just a tip, when you do add new services, don't add a new service on. Like, for example, if you have one at 10 o'clock, don't just add one at 11 o'clock. Make it 9:30 and 11 o'clock. Make both services shift. So it's the whole church making the change, not just trying to add on a component. You know, like a VCR. We all know what happened to the VCR. It doesn't work anymore. And so go multi-service, go multi-venue. Try doing multiple worship services on one campus at one time. That's a great way to develop a bench for your next location as well. And then things like simple, like if you're going to use video teaching, go and start using, what was alluded to earlier, image magnification in your worship services. Learn how to do that before you distribute that to another location. So those would be a couple of things from a weekend service standpoint that would be helpful to you.
Ryan, you might be able to help us with this one. Danny's asking, how many full-time and part-time staff do you recommend for the initial launch?
Gosh, it's definitely going to depend on the expectations for that launch. So as a team, we generally recommend that the team stays around that 1 to 100 staffing ratio. So that's one staff member for every 100 attendees at the church. Paul's done a great job of really converting that ratio to that central versus campus kind of staffing. I think, Paul, remind me, did you go 1 to 120 at campuses?
1 to 125 at campuses. That allows us at this stage of the game to go 1 to 4 central. Does that make sense? So organizationally wide, it flattens to 1 to 100.
Yep. Okay. Perfect. So that just kind of scales that a little bit. But again, that's going to determine how large are you launching your first campus. Some critical roles to be thinking about when you're launching a campus. Obviously, the campus pastor is at the top of that list. It's incredibly difficult to launch a campus without a campus pastor on staff, trained and ready to go, not coming in a few weeks before the launch, but coming in months, maybe even a year before the launch to really understand the DNA of the church if he or she wasn't on staff previously. And then also children's director and worship leader, two of those other critical roles, whether those are half-time roles or full-time roles, really is going to depend on how large you're launching your campus and what you expect that launch size to be. So again, you can kind of maintain that healthy ratio of about 1 to 125, 1 to 100 at the least at that campus. So those are a couple of things to think about. Go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to say, I think another multi-site muscle is your original launch team. I would encourage churches to launch to where you think you're going to grow versus launching to just the number of people you're launching. You know, so if you're sending 200 people, don't send 2 staff people. If you think you're going to be able to grow that to 300-400 the first year, staff to the goal, and have a little faith.
Right. And we typically look for a campus to launch about double its core team size. Is typically just kind of the general number that we use. So if you have a core team of 100, you can expect to launch at 200. If you have a core team of 150, a core team of 500, you can expect maybe to launch at 1,000. Again, just to kind of give you some numbers to project with as you're making the staffing decisions, like Amy said. That's good.
Paul, I want to come back to you on this one because your experience can specifically address this. Jay asked this question. My concern about multi-site moving forward is the sustainability after the lead pastor steps down. For example, with Mars Hill, you guys actually went through this. You were a multi-site church. Your previous pastor, Scott, took on a role with the Converge Network. You've been through this transition. Has your multi-site church survived?
Yes. I'm still here. And it's actually thrived.
And so why is that? Why is it? Because we're seeing this transition in a number of churches too that have been multi-site. For whatever reason, the pastor is either retiring or moving on to another opportunity, and they're continuing to grow and be healthy. We get to hear some of the bad stories sometimes, or challenging stories over the web. But why is it working at Sun Valley?
Yeah. So okay, I am a little hesitant in sharing because I don't want to come off prescriptive. This is just our story. It's probably not everybody's story, and it shouldn't be everybody's story. We actually had 2 lead pastors. We had Scott Rideout and Chad Moore. And Chad taught the majority of the time. And so as Scott went to lead Converge, become the president of Converge, it was a huge cultural gap, obviously, that needed to be filled, and a leadership void that needed to be filled. But the principle at play is that the senior pastor wasn't the only communicator, and he wasn't the only culture or vision carrier in the organization. And so Chad was a communicator, and he was a great communicator. In fact, he's a better communicator with Scott. If Scott was on this call, he'd say the exact same thing. And so, yeah, as that transition happened, it's not like, oh, great, this senior pastor's gone, and who's going to teach and who's going to lead. There was a deep bench when it happened, and they handed the baton off at full speed. It wasn't like one had to slow down or speed up to catch up to the other.
Yeah.
We've had this happen at a campus too. We launched a campus 45 minutes away from our original site, and within the first year, the campus pastor transitioned out. And you're faced with, oh goodness, what do we do? And of course, the big question that no one wants to say out loud is, do we shut it down? Interestingly enough, because we were video teaching and our video teaching was strong enough, it carried it for 8 months through the transition with very little attendance drop off.
So I heard a couple of key things. Number one, I think it begins with a solid vision that everybody embraces. But then secondly, you mentioned team teaching and team leadership. Mm-hmm. And whether you're in a single location or in multiple locations, mm-hmm. every church, if you're going to be healthy and thriving for generations to come, should embrace team teaching and team leadership. And any church can do that, whether you're one location or multiple locations. Mm-hmm. Let's see here. All right, Paul, there are a couple questions on mergers. And again, I know Sun Valley went through a merger. Amy, did any of your campuses come about because of mergers?
Yeah, our second multi-site / third campus was a church that merged with Eagle Brook.
All right, so tell us why was that successful for Eagle Brook?
Sure, a lot of things go into it, but there was a couple of guys on our staff, on our leadership team, who, when this whole concept came up, first a group of us met with the church to really just explore it and left that meeting with 3 options. Because I'm sure it's a hard thing for a church we say merger, but really it's not a merger. They're going to become, really part of our church. We kind of ended the conversation with, we can put a towel over our arm and serve you and try to help you fire up this corner for Christ. Second, you can become a location of ours, but you'll become us and we'll shut down and renovate a little bit. Or number 3, we can just part ways, and that's okay too. So not backing anyone into a corner. And then we had a couple guys on our staff. We just spent some great time with that congregation and the members there to cast vision around who we really were. Because, as a big church or a multi-site, the big kid on the block, you can have a lot of people who think things of you, but we wanted them to understand our heart and why we did everything behind it. And then that all came before an actual vote. So by the time the vote came, they voted to become a campus of ours, and we shut it down for 3 months and reopened, and it's been a great story. But I think the work that those 2 gentlemen did to really cast the vision internally so people understood who we were and who we weren't and what our vision was, that was a key part of the secret sauce of making that work.
Very good. And Ryan just mentioned in the chat, but in case you missed that, Warren and Jim Tomberlin have written a great book on mergers of churches better together. And so if you have more questions about mergers, that would be a good resource. Warren, I cut you off.
No, what Amy did is exactly the model that seems to work best. And just to throw a number your way, more than 1 out of 3 multi-site campuses come by way of a merger. But the merger is really the word, biblical terms, death, burial, and resurrection, just what he described. Yeah. That the congregation says goodbye to one vision that you champion and you honor, but you marry a new vision.
Mm-hmm.
Well, very good. Again, Warren, Paul, Amy, Ryan, I really appreciate you joining us today. To everybody that participated, we're glad to have had you. I will just tell you that in the next couple of days, if not sooner, we will get you a copy of that white paper that Ryan mentioned a couple of times. We'll send you some of the links that Warren mentioned to get you those resources from the Leadership Network. And more importantly, we're going to be ready. If your church is considering this next step, to go multi-site or for you to expand into multiple locations, we want to help you take that next step. And so please contact us. It's at the unstuckgroup.com/multisite. And we'd love to start a conversation with you to figure out how we can help you take those next steps. Again, thanks for joining us today, and we hope we can serve you and your church in the future.
Tony, you do an awesome job, you and the whole Unstuck team. Thanks for letting me be part of it.
Thank you, Warren.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.